Hello, everybody. Welcome to my podcast. This is Asha, and today I have an amazing guest. This is Samra. She's a men's sexuality coach and a female empowerment coach. And we have been working together before. We have a podcast together, which is the Sexpert Talks podcast. You really should check it out. We have some amazing interviews where we both have interviewed people and have been interviewed as well. And now I have the joy to have her here with me today. Welcome, Samra.
Hello, Sasha. Thank you for having me on your wonderful, wonderful podcast.
Thank you so much for joining me. And we were just having an amazing conversation before
Off script.
Exactly. We were talking about so many things that I was like, no, we really should record this. Because the idea originally was to talk about men's sexuality, because that's one of Sandra's specialization. But we started talking about feminism and about pleasure and empowerment. And the one thing that I love the most about this conversation is that we were connecting there on some visions and some turn-offs that we have had about the idea of pleasure, and some rediscovery that we have done about what it means to be in pleasure. So thank you so much for being open to having this conversation in here for the podcast.
Thank you, and thank you for starting it.
Yay. So, because one of the things that we have in common is that we come from countries that have had very specific situations, like Mexico, for example, which is where I come from. I am Mexican and Lebanese. So my grandparents came from Lebanon because they were starving after the war, after the Second World War. There were consequences around the globe, and they decided that they needed to explore another country. So they are immigrants. And then my family here from Mexico, they have always been connected to politics and to the world, and realizing that we had lived in a very authoritarian country, and that is just opening up that we saw as normal many things that are really not normal, that are really human rights abuses, has really shifted my perception of the world. And that's your story as well, similar, right? It's not the same, but it's a similar story. Your country is also a country that has a very hard story. Could you tell us a little bit about where you come from and how it's like?
Yeah, so I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from Sarajevo. I live in Sarajevo. I'm not originally from Sarajevo, but I live here now. I lived here for like 25 years. And yeah, I mean, the story of our heritage, our country, is one of constant, we were in the Middle Ages, we had a small kingdom. And then for 500 years, we were under the Ottoman Empire, which had obviously an effect culturally, religiously. A lot of locals converted to Islam. So I'm a Muslim. And then Austro-Hungarian, and then we had some kind of kingdom, and then we had communism, and then finally, for the first time in the 90s, we had democracy. So, and the downfall of having democracy is that Yugoslavia fell apart, and there was a terrible war in which Bosnia had a very, paid the biggest price of the fallout of Yugoslavia, with a lot of civilian casualties. Sarajevo, the city in which I live in, was surrounded. It was the longest siege of any European city since the Second World War. There were a lot of places in which there were a lot of massacres of civilians, and a few places where, like Srebrenica, there was an international court that for the first time proclaimed a genocide, which is the first genocide also on the territory of Europe after the Second World War. So and of course there was all these, ethnic groups, because Bosnia is a multi-ethnic country. Mm-hmm. So we're a country in which we have Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians. We also had a very vibrant Jewish community that unfortunately, obviously, because of the unfortunate events of the Second World War and the Holocaust, was greatly reduced. So we're a very mixed society naturally. So not just because there was this dictator that kind of put us all together, but we were kind of authentically very multi-ethnic, and then that all fell apart. So it was a very traumatic experience, because the society that you lived in, all of a sudden you realized wasn't safe and wasn't really what you thought it was. So, and then obviously then there's this post-conflict, post-capitalist kind of very neoliberal, corrupt, nepotistic society. So it's obviously democracy in a very twisted, and capitalism in a very twisted and very unhealthy way. So that's in a nutshell kind of like the whole history of my country.
Totally. And they are so similar in many aspects, like all this multiculturality that we experience in Mexico as well, and just like the bubble being busted and then seeing capitalism in a different way.
Yeah.
And then we are both from very conservative backgrounds, right? You being a Muslim and I being raised as a Catholic, like a very Catholic culture. We actually say Guadalupanos, which is more like the cult is more to the Virgin of Guadalupe, and it's more like very machista, very misogynist in many aspects. So it's very groundbreaking that we are now working with sexuality in cultures where sexuality is such a taboo.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, here also, I think under communism, I think not that it got liberated, but it was a little better. But then I think there was this contraction right after the war. And I think it was natural that people kind of went back to religion, but in a much more conservative, as you say, way. And yeah, I mean, for instance, my grandmother was born in, she died, but she was born in the early 19th century, like 1914, and she would wear, those veils. She would cover herself when she walked down the street. And at the time that she was being educated, there was this whole controversy as to whether or not Muslim women should go to civic schools. It was considered that they should only go to Muslim religious schools. So there's this whole cultural context within my ethnic community that really put women, in a small place. And then, there was some liberation under communism. A lot of women that before the Second World War were illiterate. So there was a lot of illiteracy, particularly among women, but among men as well. And then that changed under communism, and then that there was some progress in that regard. But yeah, definitely now it's a very conservative, I think people are much more closed now than they were before because of the ethnic divisions and the consequences of the war. And yeah, sexuality is definitely still a taboo now.
Yeah, it takes so much courage to speak about sexuality in this world. And then I'm hearing how your grandmother had a struggle to study, right? Like it was still discussed if she could study or not. And sometimes I think about that, like how we take studies and going to school for granted, when it has been a struggle for generations that are so close to ours. My mother got beaten because she wanted to go to school. Like she was literally beaten and she had to leave her home in order to be able to go to school.
Yeah.
And now we have people saying, no, school is the worst, and they are brainwashing you, and you shouldn't, like demonizing schools. And it's like, oh, it was such a battle to be able to get here, and now you want us to not want to be here.
Yeah, exactly. Because, for instance, it only recently dawned on me. I mean, I and my cousin were the first women of generations to have a higher education. So, my mother had a high school education. My grandmother's very small or very little, almost no education. And I can't even imagine what education. Maybe they had some religious education, but I don't think they had any civic types of formal education. So when you think about that, it's really mind-boggling, how far you've progressed. And as you say, it shouldn't be taken for granted, because that's not that far away. It's not like hundreds of years past. It's only a couple of generations behind you that you had to come to this circumstance that you can have education and educate yourself and be independent financially and be, independent to not be dependent on male relatives or husbands for your existence.
Because that's the background of not letting women study. That's the real purpose, right? If women study, they are going to want to be independent, and they didn't want women to be independent. So that's where it all comes from.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So sometimes it's like ironic seeing the things that people are complaining about in I don't know, for example, in the USA or specifically, when it has been a struggle in other parts of the world that keeps going. Like Malala was shot just a couple of years ago, like 5, 10 years ago, because she
Yeah.
wanted to study.
Yeah. And, sometimes I think it's also taking for granted how difficult social changes are. Because, a lot of countries in the West, I mean, with the exception of obviously world wars and stuff like that, they had at least some continuity of democracy and some type of democratization of their governments and so forth and so on. So sometimes they forget how long it takes for these types of social changes to happen, and sometimes I think there's this kind of perception, well, these countries, either they don't understand what democracy is, or they're not enlightened enough, or so forth and so on. But they forget that all of these countries, like my country, were very young democracies. I mean, we only voted for the first time in the 90s. That's the first time we ever got the chance to vote in a democratic election. So it takes time for a society to build, and for this kind of for these things to become normal and to be taken for granted, because it does take time for social change to happen. Yeah,
Totally. And then in countries that are so not heterogeneous, right? Like how each country has a different pace when it comes to social rights, to civil rights. And then we see the industry where we are at, we see this idea of pleasure based on the eyes of a culture that has like such a different history, like such different standards, like, and that is what has been like challenging for so many of us. And that's what we were talking about some minutes ago, how it was challenging to see pleasure coaches that are hyper capitalistic, that are showing pleasure as super expensive clothes, super expensive meals, champagne, and stuff that is so distant from so many women, especially from our countries. Like, it's lovely to see it, but it becomes a very unrealistic expectation.
Yeah.
And that was a turn off for both of us. We were just talking about how that was like difficult to digest.
Yeah, I mean, when I started doing kind of, because I do, women's empowerment, men's coaching, I mean, the kind of transmission for men's coaching came easier for me, because it was about, I felt that, in order for us as women to be sexually empowered, we need men that are also conscious in their sexuality. So it was easy for me. But the kind of women's empowerment from a place of pleasure and joy, although I kind of understood it in my head, I was really, really resistant towards it a lot. Although, that as part of our coaching certification, you have to go through a lot of practices, and I did, and a lot of things shifted for me and so forth and so on. But that kind of notion of pleasure was really, it was difficult for me to absorb, because, for instance, I mean, a lot of members of my family, as a result of these things, are unemployed. So they're basically surviving, and they're close family members, right? I have close family members who live on pensions that barely give them basic existence. And also in my history, so I've had my grandmother, my father's mother. They grew up in poverty, in absolute poverty. So my grandfather was killed in the Second World War. My grandmother was left with 7 children in a small city without any education, and they just had to barely struggle for their life. And my father came to a big city literally with one shirt on his back, and then slowly through education and so forth and so on, provided for himself a good life and for his children. So this notion that I can somehow, I keep thinking about her and her life and the lives of so many women that I know that are like that. And it's not just her, a lot of people, because as I just described, history wasn't really kind to us. We've had a lot of turbulences, a lot of, even in the Second World War, a lot of hunger, a lot of, all these things. So it's difficult within that context to say, well, yes, I'm entitled to my pleasure, and pleasure is something. It was, I have to admit, it just felt like something that was only the privilege of wealthy Western countries and wealthy Western people that live there that can do that. That was what I felt deep inside of myself.
Yeah, and that is when voices like ours started like shutting down, right? Like we started being more silent until we we realized that that's not that's not the only way, right? Like this hyper capitalized idea of pleasure is not necessarily the only way to live in your pleasure. And I love that you were just mentioning the books that you have been reading that made you change that perception.
Yeah. So it's only, and I feel a little ashamed of that, but it's only very recently that I got into Black American women feminist writing. So Audre Lorde, Adrienne Marie Brown. I'm so bad with names. So because we didn't plan for this conversation, I don't have any notes. So I'm just kind of playing it what I remember. But it really, I started reading that the book Pleasure Activism, and then hearing their voices from their perspective and their claim to the erotic, to the pleasure as a form of fight against racial oppression, and their right to exist within their bodies, their right to thrive within their bodies, not just survive, but to thrive within their bodies. And that just gave me such relief, because I then felt that I had permission to, within my own historical context and so forth and so on, reclaim pleasure as well. So it gave a completely different perspective of it, that it's not just about, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not just about spas, and it's not just about massages, and as you say, kind of expensive clothing and stuff which is all fine, that's also beautiful, but that's not the only expression of pleasure. And particularly for women who have been through very traumatic experiences, who historically have very traumatic experiences, pleasure becomes something much more than just something that activates us internally, something that turns us on, and something that rebuilds our lives. I think it becomes really this kind of reclaiming of the pleasure that was denied to our foremothers, all of the mothers and grandmothers that came before us. So that's I think a huge, much more. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist in the West either, or with wealthy, I'm sure that's the same. Women have been oppressed sexually and haven't had their rights and so forth and so on. And that's the same across the board. But I just felt within, my context, it just felt a little different. And when I read them, I just felt like this, oh my God, I see the purpose now. And it's not just about, and for me, what was also important that it has to have this social transformational element of it, that it's not just about, a purely capitalist viewpoint, but there's also this element of being transformed socially and having these kind of changes on a social level.
I love that so deeply, and I relate so much to that, because it's like we started seeing just one side of it, the side of the pleasure that is beautiful. And as you just said, there's nothing wrong with that. If people can afford that, it's beautiful that they do it. There's no judgment in their pleasure. It's great that they have pleasure in that way. But since it felt so unapproachable and unreal, it felt like it wasn't for everybody, right? Like I felt like, hey, if I don't have so much money to spend in champagne and macaroni and wow, beautiful. No, it's not macaroni. The French
macaroni.
Macaroni. Like if I don't have money to spend on that, and if I don't have a young, beautiful, fit body to have to wear beautiful clothes on, and then I don't belong to that world. I started feeling that way, and that shut me down for a long time, because I felt like that was not my world, because I didn't have what it takes, because the women that you see enjoying that life kind of look the same, but at least where my eyes were focused on. And then it was a huge mind-blowing gaze opener when I started seeing that pleasure was a way of reclaiming our right to exist. And that was mind-blowing for me, because I started seeing the women of color, which is Mexican women, Latina women, African women, like in South Africa doing the same, reclaiming their beautiful heritage, and Black women in the USA, and we just started seeing more women that had always been there, but we hadn't paid attention to, because mainstream pays more attention to these other normalized, whiter and more wealthy sense of pleasure. So it wasn't like we discovered that, oh, women of color can have pleasure too, or women that are not wealthy or that are not young can have pleasure too. It was like realizing that we have always been there, and we are reclaiming our voices to speak louder.
Yeah.
Because pleasure is not about spending money, but it's about standing in our bodies with a sense of pride and saying, I belong, I have a right to exist, I have a right to enjoy life. Like, I'm not just going to survive, I'm going to make it worth my time. I'm going to enjoy it, to savor it, to taste every moment of it. And that's the best revenge we can have on oppression.
Yeah.
You know, like we have been oppressed as women, and then as people from different countries and cultures. And it's a reclamation of our right to occupy our space and our bodies.
Yeah, and for instance, while you're talking, the things that a lot of things came to mind, so I keep forgetting but kind of like, because it's a topic that you can talk on for like days and days. So for instance, you know, in my country as like a new democracy, the thing about capitalist values is that it's so distorted that we're losing the true values of what we're supposed to be. So now it's all about consumerism, and that's your reflection of your success. There's nothing underneath that. So naturally, if you're looking towards something more, any expression of consumerism just makes you feel allergic to it, and you have an aversion to it, because it's very superficial. It's putting value on things that don't really don't value true things in life, like love, connection, authenticity, and so forth and so on. So that's one of the some bad sides of capitalism and new democracies, is that it has it's not about this pursuit of happiness. It's not about you getting your dreams. It's about being a part of an elite and having access to resources because you're a part of an elite, and that's how you get your wealth. That's basically how the capitalist structure functions in countries like mine. And yeah, and as for when you were mentioning, and that was one of the things for me also, because countries like mine, people are very good at surviving, because that's what we're taught to do. You have to survive, but thriving is something that we're not very, very good at. And we don't really, and there is this conception, I mean, even here, when you talk about, political reform or social reform, the thing is, well, we're not the West. We can't have a developed economy. We can't have a society without corruption. So basically what you're telling yourself, you're not worthy of living or being in a context in which you thrive, and which you can kind of actually create beautiful and wonderful things, because you're just not a part of that group of countries, of people, or whatever that is. So that was what, in line with what you were mentioning about pleasure as a form of reclaiming our right to thrive, actually, within our context, within our history, within our skin color, depending on who we're talking about, and so forth. Yeah.
That gave me chills in the heart, because it's so true. Countries like ours, we're so good at survival. We sometimes, the other day, somebody was telling me, hey, how do you manage to get this and this and this happening to you, and you still manage to make it and to keep moving and to keep going? And I was like, because I don't have an option.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
We learn in a very young age that we don't have an option, that either we keep moving or we die. So we have to keep moving. So it's like our very basic survival instinct is to keep moving, to keep going, just a little bit, just as much as we have to. So this person was telling me something like, we were talking about privilege, like how it's a privilege to focus on thriving. I'm trying to recall the conversation exactly, but it was something like, it's a privilege maybe to think that you can keep moving when you have something very hard and difficult happening to you. And I said, no, it's a privilege to think that you can stay still. Yeah. Because we people that don't have that privilege, we know that we have to keep moving. Yeah. It would be a privilege for us to stay frozen for too long. We know we have to keep going. We know that we have to survive. So the sense of survival is deeply rooted in us, but it's hardly ever connected to pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah, no, because it's about sacrifice, sacrifice towards your family, towards your parents, towards your children. And that's, and it is, I mean, a lot of, and I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about, women in our past, our grandmothers, grandmothers, and all of these things. And in most cases, some of them maybe were a little more wealthy than others, so they can maybe have maybe a better lifestyle, but all in general, they were mostly about just bare survival and taking everything on themselves to put, food on the table, to get the kids, educated, get kids to school, and if they could do that, and so forth and so on. So yeah, it's about, and then, at some point people, and it's difficult to persuade people, well, there's something other than survival in life, because, we have very recent memory of the war. So when your threshold of what a beautiful life is that it's not war, then, you can't really imagine anything other than a place in which there aren't bullets around you or things falling down, or in which you're not suffering, or there isn't food in the stores and or something like that. So it's difficult for people to move away and say, well, it's not enough that you're just living in peace, and that you're not being constantly under attack. You need to have more from life, and more isn't necessarily in a material sense, which is needed. Okay, you need a roof above your head, you need food, and so forth and so on. But it's also other things that need to fulfill you, some purpose in life, that you have to change, that you have to be in a constant state of change. And another writer that I've wanting to read, which is also a Black writer, a Black woman, African-American woman, which is Octavia Butler. She wrote, science fiction books, which I've had on my Kindle for ages, but I haven't got around to actually read it. And one of the things that she's one of her statements is change is God. So the purpose of life is around evolution and changing yourself constantly. And getting, and for me, that means actually redoing some of the patterns of the past, of history that, was left behind us, in order to move forward, to have a different place for our children and their children's children.
I love that. And I notice how eye-opening and mind-blowing it is to read authors that have been oppressed from places, from cultural statuses that have suffered oppression, because that's where real mind-blowing awareness comes. What I could get from our exchange, one of the things is that when we just saw the white perception, the white and wealthy version of pleasure, it was very limiting and excluding, because we don't all have that experience. But when we see that women that have suffered oppression have a voice and something important to say about this, that's when we can actually relate and find the real rooted original reason. Yeah. That can be diluted by the perception of mainstream pleasure, the pleasure industry. But when we see the original foundation of this, we can actually do things the way they were intended to, which was learn how to live, not just to survive. Yeah. And that makes me think a lot of something that totally shifted my mind, was that at some point my husband used to refer to issues like a test, like, oh, the universe is testing me, or I am being tested. I have to overcome this challenge, this test. And it was in his mind, his narrative was always like a trial. Like if there was a big force putting him on a trial to make sure that he deserved it, that he had to work hard to earn it. And it all changed when I started coming with the narrative of, hey, what if we don't have to prove anything to anybody?
Yeah.
What if there are no trials? What if we can choose to live from pleasure?
Yeah.
What if we can just start enjoying and living a more fulfilled version of this? And that shifted the narrative in my home, because it went from the idea of the trial and the challenge and the struggle, and that it's a very patriarchal way of living. It actually is literally imposed by the patriarchal systems. I just read about it in a book you really have to read as well. It's called When God Was a Woman. It's so amazing, and it explains how we went from a very matriarchal way of living and enjoying life, like the real original essence of life was about enjoying it and having pleasure and connecting with life and the circles of life. And then patriarchal cultures started imposing the path of the blood and the struggle and the effort, and you have to earn your place in the eyes of God, and how that has been oppressing towards our connection to life itself.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So, I mean, the only thing when you're saying, obviously, I mean, I have to state the obvious. I am a white European, but I my country is kind of like the back doors of Europe. So we're not like, you know, but that's why I feel deeply, you know, I mean, obviously I sympathize and I understand, you know, I mean, obviously it's a completely different lived experience, but I can sympathize with the voices that feel, you know, that have a different or outside perspective from what could be me in the majority, because in many ways, even though I am a white European and, you know, I'm westernized, in many ways I do feel an outsider to that world, you know, I mean, just by the stupid fact that, you know, in most countries that I have to travel to, I have to have a visa. So, you know, I have to prove, you know, that I'm going to come back to my country, that I have to show my bank account that, you know, I don't have any intention to immigrate and stay there, that I don't have any intention to do any criminal activities, just for the sake of that my passport is of a country that, you know, doesn't have international standing or doesn't have any economic or political power and so forth and so on. So that, you know, even that simple administrative thing sends this message, well, you're not really a part of this wonderful developed world. So I can really relate to this kind of more outsider perspective that a lot of these beautiful voices and women offer. And I mean, if and I say I feel ashamed that it's only now that I'm kind of discovering these things, but I guess things, you know, if we believe they happen for a reason, they're happening now, and I'm truly grateful, you know, for them to have shared and given these voices, and despite all of that they've been through, you know, this horrific racial oppression that's been generational for African American women, to find the inner strength and to find the inner resilience to reclaim themselves and to establish themselves as true, full human beings that can thrive and live from a place of the erotic, of the pleasure, and for that to be an engine for further activism and change and changing of the world. I think that's just, it's a gift that I think we all have to deeply, deeply appreciate and be deeply, deeply grateful for.
And also that privilege is relative in the sense that it depends on we cannot say, oh, all of these group of people are privileged, because it is always relative. In a group of white people, women have less privilege than men. In the group of Europe, people from your country have less privilege than people from the USA, from the UK, sorry, or from Paris. It's like privilege is always relative. Even I, as a Mexican, in a group of what is the whole of America, like Canada, America, I have less privilege than the people in Canada or the USA, but I have more privilege than the people in Guatemala or than the indigenous people in my own country. So it's always ever changing, right? Like
Yeah.
privilege is a very alive entity that changes according to the place and the situation that we are living.
Yeah. And it's very important, I think, and that's one of the things that also came to my mind, that yes, now the focus is on, white privilege, on relationships between races, particularly in the US. But as you say, I mean, I live in a European country that has privilege over some other countries when it comes to global warming. So the effects that we're feeling, although we're having some effects, isn't as devastating as maybe in India, Bangladesh, or some other countries that are really at the forefront of or some islands within the Pacific, or the Arctic Circle and so forth and so on. So I have a geographic privilege, and in the sense that we don't have issues as of yet with water, with clean water, not so much with clean air. So those are those things as well. So I think it's just about, I think the thing about privilege is understanding that there's no need to feel guilt around it. It's just an acknowledgement of who you are in a particular context, and recognizing within that context where you do have positions of privilege and where you don't. And to always be aware of that when you speak of your lived experiences, that you can say, well, obviously my lived experience isn't representative of this whole group, because there might be a group of people that I'm not representing, or that I can't speak for because I don't have that lived experience, and so forth and so on. I mean, I feel privileged in my own country for the fact that I have a job, I have a stable income, I'm able to afford to start a coaching business, which I realize is a privilege for a lot of other people that aren't in that position in my country.
Absolutely. I like the approach of Fresma, the author of My Grandmother's Hands, that says he, instead of using privilege, he started using the word advantage.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important because, I feel the same way. I have the advantage of speaking English and having a business abroad, my own location, so I can connect with people from all over the world. Having an education that many of my connationals don't get to have, or having even having the life experience of seeing sexuality as something more natural. When I have people with my same advantage or even higher advantage that are still paralyzed at the idea of sexuality. So it's always a very living, organically mutating energy, this advantage situation. And as you say, it's not about guilt, it's about understanding where you come from. I love that approach that you just mentioned.
Yeah, because I mean that was kind of my thing, because I mean I had the advantage of I lived in the US as a young child. That's why I'm fluent in English. So, and after the war, what that enabled me is to have a good job, because at the time there was a lot of foreigners, so translation services were very needed. So, and for a long time, that was something that was a deep source of guilt for me and shame, even though I was earning my I wasn't stealing, I wasn't doing any criminal activity. It was perfectly honest work. But the fact that I had something that other people didn't have, or had to work very, very, very hard to get, made me feel bad about what I was doing. And that was something that it took me a very long time to overcome, and to realize, it's not about, it actually puts me in a position where somehow I feel that if anyone is to move things forward, either through consciousness or sexuality, it should be someone like me, because I've had to overcome maybe less obstacles than someone else to come to the place. So I have a sense of, maybe duty is maybe too hard a word, but kind of like, somehow to pay off for this advantage that I've been given, I should contribute even more, and not just be satisfied with my kind of comfort zone and having my basic needs met, but actually moving forward and doing additional things that might help other people. And this is just one of the avenues that I decided to do.
Totally. I love that. Yes, using this advantage to create a change.
Yes.
Yes. And that's why I wanted this conversation to take place, because when we started talking about this, was like, we need to speak about it, because I'm sure there are other people that see these images of pleasure and don't relate, and that they need to hear from women that come from a background that it's maybe more similar to theirs, that they can also choose pleasure, because pleasure is activism. That pleasure pleasure really is activism.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely is. And I think that's just a really strong message. And yeah, it's about what you were saying. It's about recognizing this kind of connection and joy in life. And that in and of itself is a huge shift, because you're basically, as you say, you're breaking down the patriarchal values. For me, you're also breaking down capitalist. Not that I have anything against capitalism, but the way that capitalism currently functions is not in service of people, is not in service of the planet. So it has to, the kind of just the way that it functions just have to change. And by doing that, you're just kind of breaking down those things that have cemented us in these positions where we're shut down, where we're basically disconnected from each other. And, you know, a lot of people said, well, you know, as a result of COVID, we're not connected. Well, we weren't connected even before COVID. I mean, the biggest killer on a global level was loneliness. People were committing suicide on massive rates in a lot of countries and across the board, because they didn't have a sense of community. They didn't have a sense of connection. They felt isolated one from the other. So the virus, I mean, if anything, the virus reminded us of the value of how important that human contact is, something that we've been taking so much for granted.
Totally. Oh, we could just go on and on, but I really want to thank you for this amazing conversation. And I want to invite people to check out your social media, but your articles. She has an amazing article that it's on Medium and it's on Elephant Journal as well.
The Goodman Project.
The Goodman Project, thank you. About post-truth. And I love it because it's an article when she speaks about these conspiracy theories that just totally got out of control, and how they can have a very damaging effect on everything, on politics, on how we perceive the world.
Yeah. And I have to thank you and women from our sisterhood who encouraged me to trust my voice, and that I had something to say. And yeah, and you know, it's just an invitation. I think that's something that we also, that Nika Carlo, when we had our kind of racism trainings, she said something that was, I think, beautiful. You know, it's not about calling people out, it's about calling people in. And I think through that article, all I just wanted was to invite people to, and I mean, it's okay. I understand why people don't trust the media. They don't trust government. They don't trust scientific institutions. They don't trust the pharmaceutical industry. I get all that. I understand why. And I live in a country in which I don't trust institutions either. I know what that is. But I think what I wanted to do is just invite people to just listen to the lived experience of human beings. That's all. You know, you don't have to listen, just listen to the people that are fighting for racial, social, equality, that are fighting against this virus, and all. Just listen to them and what they have to say, and then base your conclusions based on that, rather than whatever it is that people are kind of basing their conclusions on.
Yes, please. That's so important. Listening to each other.
Yes.
I think that would totally change the world. Learning to listen to one another, because when people is telling you they are in pain, believe that they are in pain. Like, people don't have a reason to invent, to make these things up. Yeah. If they are telling you that they are having a very unfair disadvantage in their way in which they are perceived by their nation, by their culture, believe them. Just believe in the life experience of the people. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. It was such a delight.
You're welcome. Totally unplanned, and I want to apologize in advance if I mispronounced anything or said anything, because it came totally from my head. And next time if we talk about it, I'll prepare better.
Yes, this is the best kind of conversation. Like, we are not like scripted.
Exactly.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you too.